Hello, it's Dr. Benjamin Keatinge here again. I'd like to welcome you to the modules 7 and 8 on this course, Literature and English Language Teaching. The topic for the next 2 weeks will be text selection and also assessment. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how one should go about choosing a suitable literary text for teaching, and then also related to that, how one should follow through with those texts that one has chosen, and both to teach them and then to assess them. So the first slide here is a very basic one. What are the criteria for text selection? Well, these are things we've already discussed in previous modules. First of all, genre, prose, poetry, drama. We're going to be doing individual modules on each of those individual genre within English literature, and we'll be looking at the advantages or disadvantages of using prose as opposed to poetry, or drama as opposed to poetry, or poetry as opposed to drama. So we will be looking at the different benefits and possible disadvantages of each of these genres. Secondly, length. It's an obvious point, and we've already discussed it in the previous module. If you choose a lengthy text, you run the risk of students not actually being able to keep up with the material. Thirdly, availability. It seems again an obvious point, but clearly if you select a text which is not available easily for the students, or if you cannot provide it for them, then you are causing problems for yourself and for the students. Now, one other question that comes up, and it's something which I think is worth considering in some detail, is the relative merits of using canonical versus non-canonical texts. As I think you're aware, the term canonical refers to a literary canon, and that simply is a group or a long list of established texts that are regarded as the best and finest amongst the examples of English literature. And of course each individual culture or nation has its own canon of great writers. As far as the ELT classroom is concerned, you may either be obliged to use a canonical text because it's part of a curriculum, or you may choose to use one simply because you think it is beneficial for the students. However, some of the factors involved in that choice may involve, for example, the fact that canonical texts tend to be complicated, the language level tends to be higher, the historical and cultural ideas that are put forward tend to be complex. So there's no reason then why you shouldn't sometimes use a less well-known, but nonetheless, from a pedagogical point of view, interesting text which may be non-canonical. Again, this is something we've touched on in previous modules, and that is the cultural familiarity or unfamiliarity of the text. In other words, does it present a society which is radically different from the one that the students are familiar with? And how do you go about bridging that gap, helping the students engage with, for example, a very polite society in the novels of Jane Austen, or the very Victorian environment of the novels of Charles Dickens? This is something you need to consider for particularly older texts. And again, that touches on the whole relationship of the text to the student's own environment, the learner culture. And then obviously you may wish to teach a complete text. If you're choosing a short story, this may be totally feasible. However, if you're choosing a novel, you may wish only to teach an extract. Now, further issues regarding text selection involve language difficulty. In other words, will the students need assistance in actually understanding literally the words on the page? And obviously, the older the text, the more problems the students may encounter. Then the question of an authentic text. Many teachers regard authenticity, the fact that a text was written for native speakers, to be an important criteria for text selection. However, other teachers say that graded readers, that is simplified and abridged texts, can be equally beneficial, and for lower level learners, pre-intermediate or beginner, it may be the only option. Then, is the text difficult from a conceptual point of view? That is, are the ideas complex or easy? Are the themes appropriate? Obviously, sometimes it's better to choose themes which we all recognize, what we call perennial themes, that is, themes of love, of loss, of growing up, family, friendship, all these kinds of things which every culture and every individual is aware of. Finally, what are the curriculum requirements? Are you teaching as part of a broader course in English literature, or is it just an individual choice to try some particular story or poem or play? Now, I was mentioning the issue of canonical versus non-canonical texts. Here are some of the issues associated with those. Canonical texts have prestige, they are well known, they are famous, and this lends them a certain, shall we say, celebrity, and students can sometimes enjoy the fact that they are reading or tackling a difficult text by a famous author. But, as I was saying a minute ago, classic texts, canonical texts, can present significant language and cultural difficulties. Also, and this is something I have some experience of in my role here at Southeast European University, the older and more established texts tend to give greater opportunities for plagiarism, simply because the resources on the internet that the students can use are greater. So that's one thing to be considered. And finally, lesser known authors, non-canonical authors, may have the same or even greater benefits as far as language acquisition is concerned. Then the issue of authentic versus simplified texts. As we've been saying, authentic texts retain the words and language of the original literary work. They're written to be read by native speakers, and because they are not altered in any way, they keep their unique literary quality. In other words, what makes them special, what makes them stand out, is preserved if you teach them as in their original format. However, as we've been saying, at lower levels this may not be practical, and therefore using abridged or simplified readers can be beneficial, particularly with reading skills, vocabulary acquisition. It may mean that you don't discourage the students. It may give the students a feeling for literature even while they're not actually reading the original. And of course, there are available many classic texts in simplified and abridged form, specifically published for ESL learners. Now, when you're teaching a literary text, it's always good, as with other types of teaching, to be prepared. And that involves having obviously a thorough knowledge, a good understanding of the text itself. We've already mentioned in previous modules the idea of pre-teaching, that is, identifying difficult places, words, concepts, cultural issues, which may need to be explained to the students before the text is discussed in any detail. This may involve explaining difficult words, explaining allusions, for example, mythological allusions, explaining cultural features. And obviously it may not do any harm either to give the students some historical background, to give them some information about the author, and also to give them some social context. All of that as part of pre-teaching a literary text. As far as lesson activities are concerned, there are many of these, and some of them are discussed in your reader, the course reader. I'm thinking particularly of one of the chapters in Brian Parkinson and Helen Reed Thomas's book, Literature in a Second Language, which lists a whole range of activities which have been and which many experienced teachers use in the ELT classroom. Anyway, here are some of the sort of issues surrounding the type of activities you may choose to use. Obviously, you're aiming for some kind of reader response. In other words, you're trying to get the students to engage with the text on their own terms. You're also trying to get the students to think in a more abstract way about the issues in the text, and that may possibly encourage them to debate issues, controversies that the literary text foregrounds. There's also a possibility of using predictive exercises. In other words, asking the students to predict what will happen at the end, not even giving them the full story and asking them to predict how it will develop. There's also a possibility to aim at creative responses, that is, getting students themselves to write a story or a poem in response to a text. And many teachers also aim or use exercises relating to characters, how the students perceive and understand characters, but also the possibility of changing the perspective, of imagining how the story might appear if narrated from another point of view. Admittedly, this is quite a complex and difficult exercise, but it is one that some teachers recommend. And then we have to keep in mind, through all of this, what we're aiming to do, what skills we're trying to reinforce. Clearly, reading ability is paramount because the students have to read the text first in order to be able to give a response. Traditionally, we have used, or teachers have used, particularly with first language learners, but also with EFL learners, the written essay. And this has traditionally been the way of measuring student understanding of the text. However, there are many other written exercises that can be used in the literature class, including just asking for short paragraph length responses. And of course, we can also target oral skills through discussions, debates, and presentations. And we're also aiming for skills, and another word associated with skills is competencies. In other words, what can the students do at the end of a literature course? Can they write and speak clearly? Can they write and speak persuasively about a text? Are they aware of the literary features of the text? In other words, have they acquired a kind of literary competence? Is there any sense in which the text will produce or encourage life competencies in the students? And finally, how do we assess these competencies? I'd suggest that some of them are measurable, others less so. And finally, on that note of assessment, the question of how to assess is also related to the question of whether to assess. There's no reason intrinsically, if you're, for example, using a literary text as a break from more serious grammar or other types of language exercises, why you could not use a story or a poem just for its own sake without actually assessing it formally. Having said that, in my experience, most students are motivated by their grades. They will want, most of the time, to receive a mark, a grade for their work. I would suggest that literature is less suited, particularly in an EFL context, to traditional exam assessment. In first language context, traditionally the exam is a very important part of assessment of literature courses. I found it less useful with second language learners. So without an exam, you have to consider essays, other types of assignments, presentations, group projects, or smaller scale in-class tests which can take the place of the big final exam. And finally, just an overview of this whole issue of literary and linguistic comprehension. Obviously, at the most basic level, without understanding a text linguistically, without understanding the language, students cannot get anywhere, and that's one of the reasons why text selection is so important. But after linguistic comprehension has been achieved, then after that, literary and cultural comprehension can be aimed at. And I suggest that part of that, and this will be something we will discuss in Module 9, is the different features of the literary text, things like plot, things like character, symbolism, narrative point of view, and themes. These are all things which students can identify and discuss in literature. Finally, I'll leave you with the thought that the language barrier should never be underestimated, because if you underestimate it, you run the risk of losing the students' confidence and trust, and in that case you will not achieve your learning objectives. Thank you and goodbye.